Hi everybody, this is Mackerel Phones. I'm a book collector and avid reader, but what good is knowledge if you never share it? Let's take a look at a particularly interesting piece or two for my collection.
Ever since I was in middle school, or secondary school if you prefer, I've been interested in classic literature. When I say classic, I don't mean in the sense that antiquity is the classical period. I also don't only mean the works of writers like Hawthorne. I mean every book, in every language, that is a classic of its genre or important in some way. This hobby has led me towards many books I never would have heard of otherwise. This book, the ALMAGEST, is an example of one of these classics, one that most people have never heard of. That might include academics who study literature, since this is not the same kind of literature as Tolstoy. This volume, as you can see, is a beautiful hardcover, and as you can also see, it includes translations of Copernicus and Kepler as well. It is the 16th volume of the Great Books of the Western World series, put out by the Encyclopedia Britannica. The books are designed to be attractive together as a set, but they're not luring me in to buy the other 53 volumes. And actually, I think the more recent printings have even more volumes. Classic scientific and mathematical books are pretty difficult to find at a reasonable price in hardcover, much less together in a single volume. I was lucky enough to find this one for $4 at the University of Wisconsin Memorial Library book sale a few years back. That is such a great deal. For those of you who aren't bibliophiles, it's difficult to understand the excitement I get simply by holding this book, flipping through its pages. Actually, I think I must be the first person to flip through this copy, since most of the pages were stuck together at the edges like they just came off the press. That ripping, sticky noise you heard as you turned them was totally satisfying. But what is the Almagest? It is a book written in the 2nd century by the Alexandrian astronomer and geographer Claudius Ptolemy, evidently of no relation to the Ptolemy family whose rule over Egypt ceased about a century earlier with the death of Cleopatra VII, better known simply as Cleopatra. For many hundreds of years, the Almagest was perhaps the most influential work of astronomy in the world. Ptolemy uses the sum of generations of Greek astrology, along with intricate algebra and geometry and trigonometry, to construct a model of the solar system in which Earth is at the center rather than the Sun. This geocentric model was accepted in the Christian and Muslim worlds throughout the medieval period. By the days of Europe's scientific revolution, when scientists like Galileo were revolutionizing astronomy, the Ptolemaic model was so entrenched that it had gained religious significance. To oppose Ptolemy's model at the time was to oppose the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, we now know that Ptolemy was wrong. Totally wrong. And that level of dogma, driving people to completely shun new ideas, is never good. However, this doesn't mean that Ptolemy himself was a fool or a bad scientist. The proofs and explanations he gives are very complicated and persuasive, or such is my impression. Yes, although I stare lovingly at the geometric diagrams on its pages and the lengthy astronomical tables, I have never actually read the Almagest. Astronomical tables and wordy trigonometric proofs do not exactly make for an exciting read. Now that we have understood this much, we shall demonstrate this lunar anomaly on the hypothesis of the epicycle for the reason we assigned, first using 3 of the oldest eclipses we have, which seem to have been faithfully recorded, and then again 3 from the present very accurately observed by ourselves. In this way, our inspection will extend over the longest time possible, and especially it will be evident that the anomalistic difference comes to be very nearly the same in both cases. The Almagest might not necessarily be over my head, though. I have, for example, read and very much enjoyed a translation of Galileo's dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems. But to comprehend Ptolemy's intricacies, I'd need to exert many, many hours. I simply don't care to. Maybe if I wanted to be an astronomer. Ptolemy used the best mathematical and astronomical data available in his day to formulate a detailed theory about the solar system. Actually, it was considered the whole universe in those days. True, there were heliocentric models, that is, models with the sun in the center before Ptolemy. One was argued, for example, by Aristarchus of Samos some 300 or 400 years before Ptolemy. However, these theories did not produce the most persuasive models. And thinking men from Paris to Bukhara do not accept a scientific work for 1,000 years if it is not persuasive. Even if dogma often constrained these thinking men at varying levels at different time periods, an obviously wrong idea simply does not stand this long. Although even then, there were occasional thinkers who objected to the Ptolemaic model. Carl Sagan remarks in the opening of his book, The Demon-Haunted World, that in university he and his classmates studied Ptolemy's theory as a kind of thinking exercise. Even Sagan says that by the time they were done, the Ptolemaic model had been, quote, presented so compellingly, some students found themselves re-evaluating their commitment to Copernicus. The other books in this volume, Copernicus's 1543 On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, and selections from Kepler's 1621 Epitome of Copernican Astronomy and 1619 Harmony of the World, are of course also major texts in the scientific canon. It is fitting and perhaps ironic for these books to be included along with the Almagest. They were written in the Renaissance over 1,000 years after Claudius Ptolemy's deaths, and essentially refuted his theory. Copernicus set the baseline, and Kepler elaborated on this, developing what were later called laws of planetary motion, explaining how the sun moved the planets in non-circular orbits. Of course, even further down the line, Newton came to similar conclusions. Oh, and by the way, despite the title, Harmony of the World is not an exciting fantasy story, weird JRPG, or high-minded novel. But don't be too sad, because it does lay down the third law of planetary motion. Also some stuff about geometry and religious ideas on how planetary motion relates to musical harmonies. That last bit would be right at home in Final Fantasy, though. Of course, many other people, like the eccentric astronomer Tycho Brahe, were essential to this scientific process too. The hours of intense geometrical calculations and astronomical observations baffle the mind to imagine. I can barely focus on much simpler problems when I have a calculator, but these scientists did it all by hand. I'm grateful that people with such skill, patience, and passion exist. In this single volume from the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the reader can see the first major hypothesis of planetary motion and then its refutations. Hundreds of years of astronomical history set into the bare essentials. The march of scientific discovery. What a book! What a book! Excitement. Other exclamations. Obviously, an amateur like me cannot do a masterpiece like the Almagest justice, but masterpiece it is, however incorrect, just like Kepler and Copernicus's works, though they, of course, have prevailed. The Almagest is a major work for reasons other than its influence and rigor, however. In it, Ptolemy preserved other scientific and mathematical models of other ancient writers whose own books have not survived. In this way, the book is not only Ptolemy's own reckoning, but the synthesis of several great minds' calculations and observations. Even as far back as the 2nd century, Ptolemy, like Newton, was standing on the shoulders of giants. But unlike Newton, we only know Ptolemy's giants thanks to Ptolemy himself. The name Almagest is derived from, and I'm probably going to mess this up, Al-Majisti. This is the Arabic title that was used for the book, back when science flourished in the Muslim world. We have this title today, I assume, because Europeans initially translated the book from Arabic into Latin. The Arabic title means the greatest, and what a fitting title for a book of scientific inquiry whose ideas stood for a millennium, and whose pages, tables, and equations constitute, in some sense, the preservation and sum of a civilization's astronomy. See you around, everybody.